Jack and I are going to kind of tag team it tonight. And Jack, I'm going to bounce it over to you. Say a few things about the cover.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah. The cover. I love the cover photograph. This is obviously everyone recognizes. I think that every good picture is a combination of something you know and something you don't know. So everybody recognizes the Bijou Theater, but what's that building on the right? That's the old, originally the Schubert Hotel from the Victorian era. It later had another name, the Cumberland, I believe, Cumberland Hotel, and burned down. It was a fatal fire that burned down in the mid-40s. But this photograph is taken in the mid-20s, and you see the Bijou, and on the marquee, the word Perucci. The Perucci Players were a well-known thespian group who performed here and in Chattanooga and a few other places, but they were kind of based here for a long time. And it's an Italian name, of course, but that's not the original spelling. They spelled it for American pronunciation. Their father is buried at Old Gray Cemetery, and he spells his name Pierucci. So it's like Pierucci, and but they spelled it with a CH so that Americans could pronounce it almost correctly. But this is we don't know exactly what event this was. Some obviously very popular something going on there, and whether that was something at the theater or something they're waiting for down the street, I'm not sure. But it's interesting to note that the Bijou, this is right before the Bijou was closed for a few years by the theater company that controlled it, because there were so many new theaters. Soon to be the New Tennessee Theater was going to be open in a couple of years. But the Bijou remained closed for about 5 years, and was used during that time, believe it or not, as a parking garage for part of that time, and also had a plant store and some fruit vendor or something like that in there while they still were operating the hotel in the old 1816 building above it. But this is right before that weird period when it was closed, even though there was still demand, because they were trying to help out the other Paramount theaters on Gay Street. It reopened in 1931 and was had a combination of movies and live performances after that, as it had been before. But anyway, a great picture. There's a lot you could talk about, and I wonder how many people could bore in and see, oh, that's my grandmother on that sidewalk. But some of these photographs are that good quality that you could blow them up and make out faces. But let's look at the next one, Paul.
Just want to mention where you can get it on our website. Thank you. Of course. Yeah, I'll jump in, Jack. I guess there's many ways you could slice and dice the story of downtown Knoxville, but we did decide in this book that we would do a kind of a linear story. This is the story of Knoxville downtown, and in many cases, the story of Knoxville, like our other books. But it is not easy finding a good photograph or a good image of William Blount. I mean, I don't suppose there's any real photographs taken, obviously, because he died in 1800. But even today, trying to get a high resolution image of William Blount is pretty tricky. Most of the times, it's of a later painting that's down at the mansion. But there is a little story, a backstory that Joanna and Steve shared with McClung, and that is that Calvin McClung, whose collection is named after, wanted to try to go back to some original sources to see if we could find something belonging to depicting Blount. And I think from Wyoming, Montana, I think, he tracked down some relatives of William Blount. I'm not sure the date of that, but they did find this original kind of little miniature and took a photograph of it, and then someone kind of redrew it. So I'd never seen this before until Joanna and Steve shared it with us. So it's pretty unusual, I think. So
yeah. And by the way, that's 1749. Birthday.
You're right.
Yeah.
That's my fault. Yeah.
But
so our first chapter is Knoxville on the Frontier.
Yeah. And of course, there are very few photographs, so it's we kind of used what we had for this for that pre-photographic era.
Yeah, and that's a challenge with any book, is that even though you're talking about the late 1700s and early 1800s, even if you have an image that corresponds to it, it's doubtful it's going to be of that era itself.
And there are very few even paintings of some of these other. I've never seen a picture from life of James White, for example. So there are some of these people we just do not know what they look like. But Blount, theoretically, this is what he looked like, perhaps a little bit idealistically. Let's look at the next one. There we go.
Okay, the next one is James Kennedy's house. So it still amazes me that when you park in the State Street garage, that's where James White's original fort was. And this is a photograph that really hasn't been used or published much at all, but it was when this, in the middle section here, is the main part of the cabin, which is down, on East Hill. It's quite an interesting story that, Jack, if you want to tell it briefly about James White's fort, but this was taken in around about 1900 when it was still part of the Kennedy property.
The people in the 1800s knew little and cared less, I think, about the early history, or many of them didn't, and there was not it was not widely known that this was James White's original cabin. It had been built onto and made into a semi-modern mid-19th century house, but it was there just as a residence for a long time. Didn't have a plaque, and I doubt that many people in Knoxville even had any idea that the founder of the city had lived in a cabin that was kind of buried inside that frame house. But it was still there until early 1900s, 1903 or so, when there was going to be some development downtown, and someone bought the house and bought the cabin and moved the part of the house and moved it to South Knoxville on Woodlawn Pike, yeah. And put it there and lived in that for a while, as if it were a suburban house. It looked, you can kind of tell some aspects of where the windows are and that sort of thing about that it was this part of the house, and looked sort of like that in South Knoxville. But then in the 1960s, and I think it was partly inspired by the fact they were naming the Civic Coliseum for James White, and also James White Parkway, the beginning of the discussion of that. They decided to take this old cabin and move it to near the Coliseum and James White Parkway, which is where it is now. And that was moved in about 1968. And it's interesting to think that, it lost any historical authenticity it had in terms of place every time they moved it, because you have to start over when you are counting the years for to qualify for the National Register of Historic Places. So it's been there long enough now as a historic relic to qualify as historic in its current location. But they built the rest of the fort around, or used the cabin as part of the thing, and used some other cabins from around the region to join to it, to just guess at what his compound might have looked like in those early days, when it was really on what we know as between State Street and Central is where it was.
We do have a photograph of the book of the house as it was on Woodlawn Pike as well. So
yeah.
The next one?
Yeah.
I think we've used this in a couple of previous talks, but it's still always worth enjoying this photograph that was shared to us through our Knoxville shoebox collection by Dave Hearns at Blount Mansion. And they were given this original photograph by Lynn Sharpie and Sharp, rather. Anyway, it's just, I guess it's the earliest known photograph of what later became Blount Mansion.
Yeah. And it's always interesting and surprising to see this hill on across the street from it. That would be Hill Avenue that we're looking at, and within this iron enclosure, you see a steep hill. Of course, it's odd to see that, but it's obviously not there anymore. They built the Andrew Johnson Hotel and some adjacent structure in the 1920s that took away whatever that was, if it was still there at that time anyway. But it looks almost like an Indian mound or something. I don't think it was, but
yeah. Perhaps one of the original gas lamps, Jack, maybe.
Yeah, it could well be. They were put in the 1850s when we first got gaslit streets. All right, next one. All right, First Presbyterian Church. This is at the time, and then I think before the construction of the Tennessee Theater, I think the buildings that had been there had just been demolished. You can see the ruins at the bottom. That had been a kind of a big chemical extract factory. It's odd to think of that as across the street from a graveyard and a church, but it actually moved down to Jackson Avenue and was still there for many years afterwards. But this is where they built the Tennessee Theater, and you'd see the church back there. This is that addition on the left of the church was built in the early 1920s. So that hasn't really changed all that much. The trees are much bigger, but that's the biggest difference that you see down there with the church. There's also an addition. There are additions on to the church on the east and south sides that were added in later years, but anyway, that's right before they built the Tennessee Theater on that site.
And James White's turnip patch, right, Jack?
That's right. Yeah. That I'm not sure why he decided he didn't need a turnip patch anymore. But James White, while he was still alive, he donated his turnip patch to establish a graveyard and a church, and the city had immediate use for a graveyard, but didn't get around to building a church until 1816. The first of three churches that were on that site was built back then. But when the city was already 25 years old or so, that was the very first church in town. Yeah, this is a fascinating old map. I don't know that I had seen this before we did the research for the book, but this is an 1850s map of Knoxville that is remarkable detail. You can see the university over on the left. It was called, it was already called East Tennessee University before it was UT over on the left. And of course, that's on all those buildings on the very top of the hill that you see over there. And over on the right, you see Flint Hill, which is where the big hotel is over there now. But the creeks, basically, the original Knoxville was between First and Second Creek, and the addition of East Knoxville was fairly recent in the 1850s. But that's what East Knoxville looked like. That's all been taken away by urban renewal. But that was originally the city of East Knoxville that joined the city of Knoxville around the time of the Civil War. And of course, at the top, you see the railroad station, which is already there by 1855. East Tennessee and Georgia on one side, East Tennessee and Virginia on the other side. You see Georgia was to the west and south, and Virginia's to the north and east. But all those streets, it's remarkable. They haven't changed very much. The downtown part of Knoxville, most of the streets have their same name, except for Prince Street is now Market Street. And a couple of on the north side of the map, some of that's changed a little bit. But Marketplace, which see Marketplace, of course, is Market Square, which was already there at that time. Just barely, it had barely been established at the time they drew this map. Oh yeah, someone noted the river name was called the Holston. Then the Tennessee originally wasn't seen to begin until you got down to what we know as the Little Tennessee River. That was the beginning of the Tennessee River as it was described before the 1870s or so. And but even in the early days in the 1790s, people were saying, "Gosh, isn't it funny that this great river takes its name from a smaller river?" As you go downstream, it doesn't make sense for it to call the whole thing the Tennessee. And eventually, there were political reasons to name the Tennessee as something that begins with the intersection of the French Broad and the Holston. So that's ever since 1870s, 1880s. It's been known as the Tennessee as it flows through Knoxville. All right, this was something that was regarded as a historical monument in its day, and for some years afterwards. This was Parson Brownlow's home. And Parson Brownlow, way too complicated a fellow to get into tonight, but this was his house on East Cumberland, which doesn't exist anymore. But he and his wife Eliza lived there during the Civil War. This is where, during Confederate occupation, they kept raising the U.S. flag just bravely. I mean, that's a very vulnerable looking house to fire bombs or shooting, and he actually did get shot at when he lived there. But until he was finally arrested, he lived back in this house during the time that he was the extremely influential governor of Tennessee in the post-Civil War period. And during the time of the passage of the massive civil rights legislation, which made Tennessee different from other former Confederate states. But also, he died in 1877, and his widow lived here for another 40 years. And every time a Republican president came to Knoxville, I think beginning with, gosh, it may have gone back to Harrison, McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt visited Parson Brownlow's widow in this house. William Howard Taft, he was a Republican icon in the South, and this house was much honored during that period. But after she died, it was kind of forgotten. In the 1920s, it was torn down for an apartment building, which in turn was torn down during urban renewal. So nothing lasts forever, or some things don't, at least.
Gives you a glimpse, doesn't it, of the turn of the century, what it looked like down there.
Yeah. And some of you may remember there was a plaque over near the Coliseum that said Parson Brownlow lived near here, and it disappeared somewhere sometime in the last 40 years or so.
Never heard of that one.
It was a state historic plaque. It was an official looking thing. But this shows you how much it was a fairly dense city on the east side of Central over there. All right, here's a view from downtown from the South Shore in 1865, at the very end of the Civil War, and you see the famous prison that was known as Castle Fox on the left. Parson Brownlow himself spent some time there for a few weeks or so in 1861, at least. But you also see Blount Mansion down near the river, and I think that's Chisholm's Tavern there.
Okay.
What was known as Chisholm's Tavern, although historians think that what people knew as Chisholm's Tavern was not what people knew as Chisholm's Tavern in the 1790s. And I think up on the right side, that's the original First Presbyterian Church.
And that's the first bridge, right, Jack? It's not aligned with Gay Street as it is now.
Yeah, that's right. Federal Bridge that was replaced the pontoon bridge. This was the first permanent bridge over the river, and it was there until it was washed away by a flood in the big flood in 1867, I believe, and it was replaced several times until the current bridge was built in 1898.
Holston, Holston Park.
Yeah, and Bob days it said it aligned with State Street in those days.
Maybe Bob would know that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
This is a curious one, Jack, that we stumbled across that's not seen very often as well.
It sure is. Yeah, you found this. I'd never seen this picture before. It's a lovely, almost quaint, sort of like fairy tale look of appearance of Knoxville skyline. Sometime in the mid 1800s. We're not sure exactly when this was drawn, but this is roughly from the point of view of UT looking to the east, and you see where Cumberland and Maine come together down there, as they still do, and I guess kind of the World's Fair Park area is to the left. But I remember when there were still buildings at the very intersection. They built a long triangular building at the intersection of Cumberland and Maine that was there until probably 1980s or so. But it's a lovely, perhaps a little bit idealistic, but a lovely picture of Knoxville. A woodcut, perhaps, I guess.
And if you want to see more of these kinds of illustrations, there's an amazing map on the wall behind glass in McClung, and it's not really scannable. So, but there is several other kind of mid 1800s illustrations, which are really neat. If you're up in McClung, I encourage you to check that out.
Yeah, yeah. As Ann noted that there was an ice factory there on the left along 11th Street for many, many years, back when people had to have a factory to get their ice. But yeah.
This is one of my favorite photographs, I think, because you can't beat people, and you can't beat gaslights, and you can't beat price steers standing on Gay Street, right in front of the History Center, but about 150 years too soon.
Mm-hmm.
So we built, according to reports in the newspaper, they should belong to, believed to belong to Perez Dickinson, who was a downtown resident, but also had his island home state across the river.
Yeah, he was very proud of his big farm in the Island Home area at that time. It's kind of an experimental farm where he would try different things to make steers even bigger than you thought they could get. But,
so this is Gay Street and Clinch Avenue, 1877. Apparently, he had a massive hog as well that was paraded up and down Gay Street that got slaughtered and presumably ate, turned to bacon or something like that. Okay, this is a little later photograph, but it's in the story of the 1880s, Jack. And you've told this story many times about the Immaculate Conception second church being built, around about 1885?
Yeah, designed by Joseph Bowman, who was the first of the Bowman architects. It was. I love several facts of this. One was that this steeple was built facing not toward the middle of downtown like most churches were. Most churches had their front toward kind of the middle of town so people would see it. This was a Catholic church, so they faced to Irish town where the Irish lived, and Irish could look up on the hill and see this church, and it was very easy to find for them. But the city was interested in the fact that the Catholics were building such a tall structure here, and they say, you could save us some money, and maybe we could save you some money too, if we install a clock in the church, and we'll pay for the clock. But we've been looking for a way to solve this public clock problem because people down waiting for trains in those days, this is the 1880s before the current Southern Station was built, never knew what time it was unless they were carrying a watch with them. But they could look up here and see this clock on a steeple. And also people over in Market Square, the farmers and everybody else that were there. This was visible from Market Square and from the Southern train station. So they built a clock that the city was in charge of and kept running for a long time. And but this was became part of the structure of the steeple of the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. The second one was built on the site. But this picture, I think, Paul, is from about 1920 or so. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I believe so. We hear it every day. Still works.
Yeah.
To do with the lick of paint, really, the face of the clock. But it's probably not an inexpensive job these days.
Yeah.
Okay, Boomtown, Jack. After the Civil War, and things kind of got back to some kind of normalcy, as you might say, or maybe not.
Yeah.
We talked about one called Dick Payne recently.
Yeah. This is a really fascinating story, and it was interesting nationally because Harper's Magazine wrote about this guy in the 1850s. During the era of slavery, this was a black man, a free black man in Knoxville who made his living selling fresh water. And he was, in fact, has been described as from 1840s to the 1880s, Knoxville's main source of fresh water. In a time before we had utilities pumping water into our houses. If you needed fresh water, he had knowledge of some underground springs, and he would fill up this barrel every day and might make several trips just selling water by the pail to anybody who had a nickel or whatever to buy some. but he made a living this way. And like I say, Harper's Magazine in 1857 or so came and did a story about Knoxville and what made it different. And one was the fact that our main source of water was this one guy with his mule, and a barrel of water that he pumped from some spring that he knew about, and maybe others didn't know about. But a remarkable business success, I have to say.
Didn't he run for public office, Jack, as well?
I don't know about that.
Recall that maybe he did when he was quite old.
And could well have. I don't know.
Someone who needs a little bit more study on him.
Yeah.
Okay, this was a photograph you may have seen. I saw this on Facebook, shared by Patrick Hollis, who's the director at Mabry Hazen House, and he had found it because it relates to the Mabry story there. But it's from Library of Congress, and I think, Jack, this got you started on Knoxville history, didn't you, when you were a little lad learning about this gunfight?
You're absolutely right. I was reading my great grandfather's collection of Mark Twain in Dickinson County, Tennessee, in an old house, antebellum house there, and was fascinated with the story that I ran across in Life on Mississippi about this gunfight in my hometown, which I'd never heard about. And I was probably 11 or 12 years old at the time, and I thought, well, gosh, why don't we hear about this story? It's fascinating. And this was the gunfight, of course, when Thomas O'Connor short story is that Thomas O'Connor, the banker, a millionaire banker, and he's standing in front of his bank, shot Joe Mabry Sr. and then Joe Mabry Jr. Just afterwards. But Joe Mabry Jr. had just shot O'Connor at the moment that he got shot. So all three men died at once. I have never seen a depiction of this event, especially a contemporary depiction of the event. So this was quite an interesting find that Patrick ran across. That building, by the way, is still there, although it's been much added to, and you have to look to the side to see the original building. It was a 3-story building at the time that this happened in 1882. Now it was a 5-story building later on. Okay, the question, why were they shooting at each other? That's a good question. They had O'Connor and the elder Mabry, who was in his mid-50s at the time, had words at the racetrack in South Knoxville the day before, and there are various stories that there was a land dispute, also stories that Mabry believed that O'Connor had something to do with the death of his son in a saloon gunfight about a year before his other son. So he had 2 sons who were killed in gunfights on Gay Street, and as he was killed himself. But we really don't know. It's kind of an interesting mystery, because they were all very wealthy men, and perhaps didn't have that much to complain about. But they had words, and the story is that O'Connor said, I will plead with you not to walk by my bank tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, or something like that. And of course, that was exactly what Mabry did. Mabry was a contentious fellow and had actually shot a guy before in his past, and was known to go armed. So O'Connor got the drop on him. I don't think Mabry had a chance to draw, but then he didn't know that Mabry's son was also there, and Mabry's son shot O'Connor simply because O'Connor had shot his father. So a very efficient gunfight. All 3 men were killed. This is the 1 year after the gunfight at OK Corral had the same body count, but actually more people were wounded and not killed in the Mabry-O'Connor gunfight, because a lot of bystanders were there. I think 11 bystanders were wounded in the spray of shotgun fire, I think.
Much across the street from where those steers were.
Yeah.
If anyone doesn't have their microphone muted, they would appreciate that. We're getting a little feedback. Thank you. Okay, let's move on, Jack. This is a photograph that Joanna and I found think it was in the Jim Thompson an album. Obviously, Jim Thompson didn't take it because he was only about 3 years old, but it was certainly is in his collection. But it took me a while to figure out where we're actually looking. We're looking down, I guess, from what we would call Summit Hill today, or down Vine Street, probably, to what we call the 100 block. And Summit Hill now would be on your right, but it's the lane of the cornerstone of the very first Lawson McGhee Library.
Yeah.
Amazing photo.
That's a rarity. It really is. And of course, the building is still there, is known as the Rabori building, and a 3-story brick building on Gay Street, which is now a giant residence. But that was a big deal to build a public library in Knoxville. And in fact, this is I think it's the most durable public library in Tennessee history. I've heard that there's not a library that has lasted for 35 years, except other than Lawson McGhee.
And an interesting view of what we call the Old City now, up in the top left there.
Yeah.
Behind it. Yeah, a lot of trees in the middle too. I mean, it's a pretty interesting shot.
Yeah, very much so.
Go on.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Ever since I've been delving into Knoxville history, I think this photograph comes up a lot, and so that's about what we wanted to do in this book. We wanted to have a whole bunch of classics that you've probably seen before, and a whole bunch of photographs that maybe you haven't, or some you've never ever seen before. But as I was saying to Jack earlier today, what we like to do at the History Project, and feel it is our mission to do, is that, to tell you the stories behind these photographs. So sometimes these photographs are just, sometimes there's not much known about them or not told. But I did go back into the newspaper record looking at this. And of course, many circuses came through Knoxville, like you would expect any town in America. But it kind of was an interesting story, as told in the small caption with this one, that the P.T. Barnum Circus was just wildly popular, and people flooded into Knoxville to see it in 1886. And it was so popular that there was just, especially if you came towards very late, I mean, there was just no room at the inn or the hotels to stay at. And people were, from out of town or from just outside Knoxville, from, I think, Kingsport and Chattanooga, people came up from, and people were just sleeping under the stars. Because there just wasn't enough, the resources in downtown just wasn't enough to accommodate everybody, really. And the circus grounds, could be all over town, but I believe it was over on Asylum Street that year. But again, we're at Gay and Clinch, I think, and right where those steers were, 10 years before. But it is really one of the most iconic photographs in Knoxville history, and Jim Thompson didn't take it, but it ended up in his collection, I guess, of photographs that he was acquiring as kind of a curator of photographs. When at what age, I don't know, but Jim Thompson's. We can thank him for more than just taking photographs, for sure.
It's interesting to speculate about whether P.T. Barnum might be in that shot somewhere. He was still alive and in charge of the circus at that time, so he did come here on several occasions.
Yeah, I mean, Gay Street was the place to be then, just like it is today, really. Yeah. Okay, we got 2 or 3 kind of like also on Gay Street of businesses. Jack, you want to talk about Woodruff's real quick?
Yeah, Woodruff's was founded by a Union veteran, W.W. Woodruff, who and it began as a hardware store and kind of evolved into a furniture store over the years. But had hardware and cutlery, and of course, hardware could be anything from tools to fine silverware. But it was right on Gay Street. I think it was in the same place for its whole history, if I'm not mistaken. We don't know. I don't know what he looked like well enough to be able to tell whether he's in that picture or not. But one thing that we have puzzled about is that white lion, because Paul was just looking at that today, and we think that is the same white lion that became kind of the symbol of David Chapman's later pharmacy, which had nothing to do that I know of with Woodruff's. But his pharmacy had that white lion, and they were called the sign of the white lion or whatever. And I think one of his partners was named Lyons, and so it was it's interesting to think the different uses that lion might have served over the years. It's an interesting mystery that we'll look into that and see what more we can find about it. But
well, there's a photograph of it in the with the Chapman story that I did for Knoxville Lives 3, and whether it's the same lion or not, it looks very, very similar. A lion of that shape and size was on Gay Street for probably the best part of 50 years.
Yeah.
Maybe longer.
Yeah. And Woodruff was there for 120 years or so. I bought a dining table there in the 1980s, back when they were the last. I think the last time I ever had an elevator operator run me up and down the floors was in the 1980s when Woodruff was still there as a furniture store.
Of course, their name is still on the building, right?
That's right.
And actually, we're not showing a picture of Hope Brothers jeweler store tonight, but if you go down Gay Street today or this week, they've taken off the front sign, I guess, that said Sapphire, the bar there, and it does reveal Hope Jewelers or Hope Brothers there. Just saw that this morning.
Yeah.
Great photograph. Shame it's a little damaged, but I guess it's old. It's an old photo.
Yeah.
And here's just a zoom in of these dudes and these chaps.
Yeah.
Guess they would sell you anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And Georgette, I have no idea where that lion is. If everybody has a lion in their backyard or something, let us know about that. We'd love to figure that out. And
I slipped this in late. This may be the same lion on a circus cart or a parade cart. Chapman Drugs was originally called Chapman Lion, and the other name of it now, but it was the Lion brand. So and we've seen that LYON and also LION. So somebody obviously was having fun on this, promoting their pharmaceutical drugs. Well, Chapman, it says on the back. Yeah.
And Paul, this was a stereopticon picture, right? With two.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, there are 2 or 3 in the book. There's the zoom in on the left shot. Yeah.
That's you probably all know that it was like a Viewmaster in the Victorian era that you would look in and see an apparent 3D image by looking at 2 slightly different photographs.
Great shot. Okay, as a former journalist, Jack, you'll enjoy talking about this one.
Yeah, this is the Sentinel office in the 1880s. This is when there may have been 3. I think there were 3 newspapers at this time, and one of them was in daily newspapers in Knoxville, and one of them was the Sentinel. This was when they were first getting started, I think. But look at these guys; they're pretty proud of what they do. And look at the guy on the left; he's obviously got used the printer with printer's ink on all over his apron there. But this was over on Commerce Street, I believe, in the vicinity of what's now Summit Hill Drive. But yeah, they're just tough looking newspaper men.
Definitely are. Okay, this is the photograph that's been in quite a few Knoxville books over the years, but it's worth putting it again with a little context. Gay Street 1890s. Jack, on the left over here, this is the old Lamar house that for a time was called the White House. You can just make out on the left.
Yeah, it was painted white, and it was a hotel that they called the White House.
And across the street, you've got the Storp Theater.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that was there in 1872, and yeah, go ahead.
And the old, the First Baptist Church, just a little further up.
Yeah.
And also on the right, as we'll see in the next shot as well, the old streetcar depot, HQ, I don't know what you would call it, streetcar barn or streetcar HQ. And you can see it here from, I guess, a few years later, you can see the tracks going in. Seen that photograph tons of times and could never figure out where it was. You can see at the top just barely 18 and 89. So that was later, wasn't it? What, by 1908, I think it was the Colonial Hotel.
Yeah, they moved the streetcar barn. Some people may be old enough to remember when it was over on Main Street in the old auditorium building. But they moved that there in the 19 teens or 20s, I guess. but yeah, this was the earlier one, and it's there's a question about Gay Street being wider than it is. I think it was about the same width, because the buildings are still a lot of them are still there, and
yeah, I think Dee Dee, it's optical illusion with the streetcar lines, I think.
Tracks, yeah.
Because you've always maintained, Jack, that Gay Street's pretty narrow, really.
It is. I mean, compared to a lot of downtown streets. In fact, I remember when they were filming October Sky here, they thought that there was a scene that was set in Indianapolis, and they said, well, Indianapolis has wider streets than this. Where people going to believe that, but they shot it there anyway, and it passed. But I think it looks narrower now, partly because the building is so much taller. I think the perspective, tall buildings make a street look narrower and narrower. That's my theory, at least. But over on the right, I just noticed you can see the top of the, on the left, I'm sorry. On the left is the top of the old Schubert Hotel, which was right across the street. Yeah, that little had like that Victorian tower on the corner there. And that's the building that was burned down in 1946, I believe.
The Cumberland Hotel?
Yeah. Yeah, it was later called the Cumberland. But the Schubert family are known for lumber, were the same people around that hotel in the 1860s and 70s.
Let's go on.
Yeah.
This was another example of a photograph that I saw I really liked in an old fire department booklet that they used to do every year. And Joanna and I finally did track it down when she tracked it down for us, and kind of had a little laugh about the little calf here, but to kind of put it into perspective, this is Gay and Union. So that is what we know as the Taylor Lofts. That was that building that withstood the Great Fire of 1897, which we talk about in the book. We've got 3 or 4 photographs of that fire, but we're not going to cover it tonight. It's just one story too many, but...
and that's the Fidelity building just on this side of it, which is still there today too, without the gable on top.
This one here, yeah. I think we're going to see that again in a minute or two, aren't we?
But interestingly, you notice there's nothing to the left of there, and that's because that was the old what they call the old baseball grounds, and it was a very steep hill downward, and it was hard to build a building on, and that's why they played baseball there for 15 or 20 years. When baseball was new to Knoxville, when in fact it was the first team sports in Knoxville history, and they began in the 1860s, just after the Civil War. But that I don't know if they were still playing baseball when this photograph was taken, but it took a while before people had the wherewithal, the money to build buildings big enough to hang on the side of that steep downhill slope, and that just changed the whole landscape of that block when they did that.
I'd never seen that photograph until we worked on this project.
Yeah, me neither.
There's another lot of closer up. Shame it's not a little bit clearer. But
there's a short. Yeah, there's like a calf of some sort on the left there, having a standoff with a little boy or something with that. Can't tell what's going on there.
Okay, Jack, we're on Gay Street, and then we've had a few discussions about this photograph and the next one.
Yeah, we have. This, we believe, is what it says it is, the Blue and Gray reunion on Gay Street in 1890. This was an extraordinary event when they invited the veterans of the Battle of Knoxville on both sides to come together and have a big convention. People who had been trying to kill each other, people who had perhaps even wounded each other, came together in this giant multi-day party, both downtown and in on Fort Sanders area. But this was a big deal, and but you see the Woodruff building right in front of this, which we were talking about earlier. That's the big hardware building there, and but we have another picture, another point of view of Gay Street here, and we're not sure if this is the same day. This has been described as the Blue-Gray reunion, and we think it's in the 1890s. And Bob has been saying there might have been a bigger reunion in 1894. This is that would make sense, because to me this didn't look like 1890. Things were changing so fast in the 1890 that you can kind of 1894 doesn't look like 1890 so much. This is a street with a whole lot more telegraph and telephone wires than they had before, and also you see electric streetcars in the streets, which were brand new in 1890. And I don't think you would see a scene with at least 3 of them in one shot as early as 1890. So I think this is probably the mid 1800s. And I did exactly that, Bob. Counted the stars on the flags, and I got different numbers. There are several flags in this picture, and there were so many new states being added in 1890 and the early 1890s and out west that they have their numbers don't match because some of them have 2-year-old flags and some of them are brand new. So it's that didn't prove it as cleanly and cleverly as I thought it would. But that's as someone asked earlier, that's the First Baptist Church steeple in the background there.
Right,
yeah, and yeah, anyway, it's a fascinating urban scene from a height of what, 3rd or 4th story, and it's fun to look at that rather buxom woman in the open window there, looking down at the proceedings. But anyway, it's a amazing shot, I think. All right, here's a home of Charles McClung, one of the big, a member, of course, of the McClung family that was very prosperous and merchants mostly in that era. But this was a reminder of the fact that there were big mansions on Main Street in those days. But yeah, really elaborate Victorian, probably 1880s mansion there. And we have another one, don't we?
Pretty much across the street, really.
Yeah, Andrew Jackson Albers, who is a Union veteran. I think he survived a Confederate prison camp. He'd been a Navy veteran, had been a Navy pharmacist, had been dispensing drugs and ships and so forth. But he landed in Knoxville after the Civil War and began a pharmaceutical company, wholesale pharmaceuticals, and did extremely well with it. And it was his wife, who died very young, that he memorialized with the elaborate fountain that was recently reconstructed in Old Gray Cemetery. But this was right on Main Street at Locust, exactly where the Medical Arts Building is today, and has been since the 1920s. All right, I love this picture. A lot of you may have read my piece about Professor Ayres and what a big deal it was when he was elected president of UT, and he was the first president of UT that it was ever inaugurated with a big public ceremony in 1904. Brown Ayres had been a very prominent professor at Tulane, and also kind of was known to the public in New Orleans for having introduced all this amazing stuff from radio to X-rays to all. He was fascinated with all the wonders of this new electric world that he kind of helped popularize. He'd actually worked with Alexander Graham Bell demonstrating the telephone in New York and early in his career, and had known Thomas Edison and corresponded with him some. But Brown Ayres was elected president of UT in 1904, and and he'd been here before, and had actually been the first one to demonstrate radio in Knoxville that we know of. In 1902, he had been here, still as a Tulane professor, and had demonstrated radio up on the hill in a big kind of one of the summer schools of the South, kind of Chautauqua type things they had up there. But anyway, this is the occasion of this photograph, but the setting of the photograph you may not recognize is Main Street. Right across the street from where we're standing is the old Woman's Building, which had been built to be the Knoxville Pavilion at the 1897 Centennial Exposition in Nashville, and was moved here piece by piece, I assume. reassembled and served as sort of an art gallery and meeting place. And I think they may have had dances here, exhibits of various sorts. A fascinating place, and unfortunately was there for only a couple more years before it burned down, probably as a result of holiday fireworks in late 1906, I believe. But this is the eastern end of the Baker Federal Courthouse, which some of us still think of as the Whittle Building on Main Street. But yeah, but the big ceremony, by the way, was at Staub's Opera House, which was across the street from where we were. All right, this is an African American temperance demonstration in 1907, and this was the temperance era. And the more you read from the papers in the early 20th century, the more. And the first thing I do when I get home is I'm going to have a beer. So I'm not saying that I wish they had succeeded in every way, but it makes sense. Temperance makes sense when you read a lot of newspapers from 1900, 1905, because there was so much violence in the saloons during that period, and you had white temperance groups and black temperance groups, and it was a very passionate and I think thoughtful and earnest effort that they made to try to control alcohol, which was ravaging families and causing so much trouble for the police and everything else. But anyway, they're walking down Gay Street, the 600 block of Gay Street, across from the Tennessee Theater. Basically, this is around where the Cruise Park extension is, where the Rosenbeck building was. See, Rosenbeck was he was more or less an interior decorator guy. He had wallpaper and paint and decorations for your house. And they say it was an amazing building to walk into because he wanted to look really pretty inside, so he can picture what your house would look like if you enlisted him to help make it look better. But anyway, this is a fascinating picture. If we can see some faces. If anybody can tell us who any of these people were, that would be great. We'd love to, if anybody recognizes anybody in these pictures, please let us know. But anyway, temperance was successful that year. In Knoxville, we banned saloons. Only men could go into saloons, and only men could vote. And men voted to ban their own saloons at the end of 1907. And saloons remained banned for a long time. We got beer back in 1933, but we didn't get liquor by the drink, which we'd had up until 1907, until 1972, I guess. So, but believe it or not, violence has never gotten as bad as it was before 1907. Since then, I'm working on a story about that. But I think the murder rate in the 1880s and 90s was even higher than it is today. All right, Fire Chief Sam Boyd with Ned and George. These look like big horses to me. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, they do. There's a name for them, isn't there? And I can't think of it, but I just love this photograph because animals always kind of bring a smile to the face when you see them in old photographs. But yeah, he's the only fire chief, right, Jack, that has been killed in service. Yeah, he had several heart attack during a fire in 1929, but the only fire chief to have died in the course of duty. Yeah, it was a downtown fire that he was trying to put out. But I guess Percherons. Is it Percherons? Is that what the suggestion is? It's the name of the horse, type of horse. Thank you for that. I want to pause and just say that this photograph, even though it just says McClung Historical Collection, but it is part of the Russell Harrison photo collection at McClung. And I came across his name because he took a lot of photographs in the 20s of the Smokies. And he was kind of one of the owners of Knoxville Engraving Company, or one of the leading investors or leaders of it. But he has a wonderful, if you ever get a chance to do some photo research at McClung and actually get to look in the Jim Thompson's collection or part of it, or Russell Harrison is definitely one to check out. I guess he was also like Thompson, he was collecting photographs from an earlier era, maybe not this one, but he had quite a few from like the Perez Dickinson steers was from the Russell Harrison collection. So he's somebody that needs to have a little bit more study of him on.
Yeah.
Okay, from horses back to zebras. I threw this in for Joanna's benefit because she said, I think she said in an email that if people love animals on Gay Street or horses, they'll definitely love zebras. So
yeah.
Again, just I think we were looking at one a few months ago of a military parade right outside the Imperial Hotel, and here we are back at the Imperial, and everyone is hanging out on the roof, a little patio there, or whatever you call the balcony. It's just looks like Bedlam, really, doesn't it?
Yeah. The Imperial was a pretty fancy hotel that stood where the Farragut was later built. The Imperial burned down in a lightning fire in 1916. So it was replaced by the Farragut, which is still there, I'm glad to say, and now a hotel again. But you notice it's got a pool. It advertises pool on the front there, and some of you may remember Naffle and Breakbull photograph studios. That's there. Billiards. It was a fun place to live, even without alcohol by 1910. But the Circus was bound for who knows where they set up. They used to set up, as Paul mentioned, and kind of on the near outskirts of downtown, sometimes on the east, sometimes on the north side. But I don't know for sure. That's a fascinating looking little hearse-like thing with looks like monkeys or something on the statues.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very dignified looking chimps there.
Let's move on. Here's another stereoscopic shot.
Yeah.
President Taft on the back here.
Yeah. I mentioned that Taft was here in 1911, and this was at the time of the big Appalachian Exposition at Chalabi Park, one of three big expositions during that era. But Taft came to Knoxville and gave several talks. I think this actually was, if I'm not mistaken, was on November 11th, 1911. So it was 11/11/11. But he gave talks out at I think he visited Chalabi Park, but he gave a big talk at the Atkin House, which was exactly where the Regis what the Regis Square is now, and big dinner talk there, but also spoke at the auditorium, which was near the Bijou Theater, the big public auditorium on Main Street. But very popular president here, not quite as popular as Teddy Roosevelt had been before, but a very popular Republican president of that era. All right, Holston Bank, of course, is on the left, and many of you will recognize that is still there, and it's now one of the more exclusive, I might say, residential places in town. There are $1 million condos in that building today, that building was built in 1912. But you see a lot of other buildings that aren't there anymore, like the billiard saloon next door to it, and in the area as we kind of go down the street, Rosenthal Drugs, and Naffle and Breakbill on the other side, which we saw briefly earlier. So it's a different Gay Street, but one that you can recognize because enough buildings are there that you can see them. The dark building on the right is the Fidelity building that's still there today, without the fancy top. At some point in the 1920s, people started taking down the fanciness of previous eras, and I think simplifying buildings to some extent. But I think I see Miller's already there. Oh yeah, this is just, already there. All right, this next one is a bit down the street, and it's this is not as good quality as our other pictures because this came from a video, a motion picture newsreel that was taken in 1919. A really rare shot that was discovered just a couple of years ago by the folks at Tamas, who found this newsreel on the West Coast somewhere. But this was not of the riot itself, but of the period of martial law just after the riot. And this is a black man being frisked, and which was kind of the rule. If a black man were to wander into the white. They actually divided the city for a few days into a white section and a black section. If black people wandered into the white area, they were frisked, and if they were carrying a pocket knife, they would take it away. So that was this is a fascinating, very short, not more than a minute or so, film that we once showed in one of our events at Maple Hall. But that showed the damage from the riot, for one thing. The fact they kind of blew up the jail almost, and wreaked havoc up and down. The white mob, mainly a white frustrated lynch mob, had destroyed a lot of the retail part of downtown Knoxville. All right, this is kind of fascinating to see, because this picture was taken more than 100 years ago, but has these people at that era didn't often get chances to see pictures of old Knoxville. And Paul has pored over this picture and looked at it, and I perhaps should have let Paul talk about it, but he discovered that there are 2 photographs that are in our book that these people are looking at in 1920.
First one being here, there's the prize steers again, and then below it is that circus paint, is Circus 1886. So.
Yeah, the elephants picture. Yeah, that gets your attention. Steers and elephants. But yeah, these are people. They're in the modern era. They don't. What do they know about 19th century Knoxville? But they're kind of curious about it. So it was. Where'd you find this, Paul?
I think it was back in the.
Well, it's McClung, but
Russell Harris. Yeah, it's either a Jim Thompson or it's a Russell Harrison collection.
Yeah,
one of the two. Yeah. I'm sure it'll say in the book. Definitely. And just a few yards down, this is another fantastic shot, really, from McClung in front of the Farragut Hotel in 1924. And if we zoom in a little bit, we'll see that the guy on the right in the middle is Colonel David Chapman, the leader of the movement for the Great Smoky Mountains, and he is playing up the camera for the Keystone Movie Company that they really hoped would come and take some great footage of the Smokies, but it didn't really turn out that way. They did take a lot of footage, but there was a dispute, and it was never, as far as I know, ever published. Or shown, and caused a lot of grief. Thompson was very upset about that. But he is standing there with the commissioners for, who was charged with finding the location of the next national park in the east, of which Knoxville hoped to be. So really, just a week or two before, Chapman, along with Jim Thompson and others, had been in the Grove Park Inn in Asheville trying to plead their case. And it was because of Thompson's photographs that he displayed, because Chapman told him to load up his car with his best photographs and drive over to Asheville, that the commission decided that they would actually go and look after the Smokies after all, because they had decided that they weren't going to bother. They were very enamored with what I think was Grandfather Mountain, wasn't it? And maybe somewhere else in Virginia. But those photographs changed. So Chapman is about to lead them off into, I guess, a caravan of cars and go over to the Smokies. And Paul Adams and a bunch of others were going to give them on a hike, take them up to the top of Mount LeConte, actually. Yeah,
a lot of interesting detail here. This is the Farragut Hotel where a lot of the conversations about the Smokies happened. But as Bob Davis mentioned, it was common to have a railroad office at a hotel, so you could just buy a ticket for the railroad to Cincinnati or whatever from the L&N shop in the Farragut Hotel. And you see a interesting guy on the left who's disabled, an amputee. I don't know if he's perhaps a World War I veteran or what, but he's at least interested in the scene there. But of course, Keystone was the same folks that we know Keystone Cops from. They were the Hollywood studio that created the Keystone Cops comedy series. And it's too bad that we don't have that the film they made. That would have been fascinating. But yeah, the story about Knickers, I can't answer that. That they are. I suspect that they were more active people at the time. Were that was as an option for people who are expecting to be active, like perhaps doing some. What year is this? Probably 20.
24.
4, yeah.
24.
Yeah.
1924.
But they were. I might recommend that people who had to carry a lot of stuff and do a lot of stuff might wear knickers, but it was not all that common for grown men to wear knickers in the 1920s, unless they were planning to do something athletic and outdoorsy, I think.
And it's 7:10. We've got a few more pictures to go, but if you want to hang out with us, you can see the Louisville and Nashville Railroad ticket office. So we're going to go there next, actually.
Yeah.
Just kind of an establishing shot. I'm pretty sure this is late teens, early 20s, Jack.
Yeah. 1905. That was built in. Yeah.
And the inside of it, which I'd never seen this one.
Yeah. The Crescent News lunchroom. I love the fact that they had a newsstand associated with a place you could sit and read a newspaper. But some pretty fancy coffee making equipment, looks like, behind the counter there, in what, circa 1920 or so. But they've done a wonderful job with the interior of the L&N. They don't have this in there today, but it's now, of course, the STEM Academy, and a great use of an old building. And most of the building does look like it did in 1905 when they built it. But this station was in business until 1968. The last train left there then. The Southern station stayed open for just a couple more years.
See a slice of that cake right there in that cake holder.
Yeah. I just don't want to pull up have a seat and read a paper and have a cup of coffee from those ladies. Leave a good tip.
Pretty sure I've never seen that photo before. I mean, it's just, you could spend a whole day or a whole month just browsing on the McClung collection online, and of course everything they have is not on there. But sometimes it's just fun to put in a decade or a year and just see what comes up. And I think that's how I found this one. Yeah. The 1920s. Okay, not far from there is this one, and I thought it was interesting because the candy factory. It's kind of a name. I'd never really thought about it actually being a functioning candy factory, Jack.
Yeah, Littlefield and Steer. It's amazing. There were 6 or 7 candy manufacturers in Knoxville during the Victorian era, but none as big as Littlefield and Steer. And this was a local company that had a national reach. They were all over the place. In fact, they even had some international sales. But they made all sorts, from bonbons to chocolates to all sorts of things. And they had their factory downtown until they built this in 1917 or so, and remained there. It was a big deal. It was our candy factory until early in the Depression. It closed, and it was followed the early deaths of the founders, and that may have helped precipitate their demise. But anyway, it was there for a while. They tried to turn it into a group of people in the mid 1930s that included Eugenia Williams' ex-husband. Tried to turn it into a beer brewery after beer was re-legalized in 1933, and that was in the works for about a year and fizzled out somehow. But it was just used as a warehouse for many years until the World's Fair, and it was reborn as a candy factory and served as a candy factory even after the fair until just 4 or 5 years ago. I think they finally gave up the chocolate factory that was there. So, but now it's a residential place and has been for 20 years or so. All right, this is flooding at the bottom, the area that we know. Actually, this is probably very close to the area where they're talking about building the baseball stadium. Was a place with a large number of Black people living just to the east of the old city area, and it was very inexpensive, partly because it flooded, almost every year, sometimes more than once a year. And I've read some really kind of terrifying stories of floods that they would people who lived in these kinds of houses would be asleep, and they might wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and hear the water coming up under the floorboards, and know they were going to have to get out and get on the roof, perhaps, to survive, and just wait for it to go back down. But the flooding during this time, not only the fact of property damage from flooding, but typhoid, other diseases were just rampant during this period, and it was really for many people, it was kind of a third world sort of existence down there. They tried over the years to re-engineer First Creek to make it work, and didn't really succeed, I think, until the 1960s, I guess. It hasn't flooded much in that area, at least, since then.
This is another photograph that's been shared with us through the Knoxville shoebox collection from the Sydney Mark Pro 2. They've got a fantastic collection of all kinds of things, but
the
1930s.
And I want to emphasize the shoebox, because we have a lot of good pictures, but we know there must be a whole lot more out there. And if you have pictures, family pictures, whatever, in your possession, and you want to share them with us, we'll just digitize them, keep them for future historians forever in digital form, and you can keep, of course, the originals, but give you credit every time we refer to them or use them. So, and we're grateful to the people who've contributed those images. All right, here's
go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, this is, I learned about this when I wrote my Old City book. This was the very last livery stable in downtown Knoxville. And at one time there were 30 or 40 of them in downtown. But this livery stable on Central Street, very close to, if anybody remembers the Jig and Reel and whatever's there now, this is where that was. But this livery stable, I think these photographs were taken at perhaps the last day of the livery stable, because it closed about 1935, 1936. And I suspect a photographer, and this has been attributed to Charles Crouch, the same guy who many years later died at an advanced age and left the park that we use in downtown Knoxville. He was a TVA photographer. But he might have heard about this last livery stable in downtown Knoxville closing, and went down there to take some pictures on the final day of it. But of course, livery stables were where people could rent horses and board horses, and it was they were just a basic fact of life before automobiles. That these were all over the place. Prior Brown was originally a livery stable, but this is the very last one. And then here's another photograph attributed to Charles Crouch, and just of South Central, a guy shopping at a secondhand store, which was, I think, for many years was one of the main kinds of businesses that were down there. And they did a big business, because they had a lot of, thousands of very poor people lived within walking distance of South Central, and depended on, secondhand goods to live, live their lives. Yeah, close up, a very good photograph, because we can blow it up and see there's a whole display of locks there with keys, and clothing and pipes and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing that people would sometimes not just buy, but rent plumbing down the Old City. People were so poor that they couldn't afford a bathtub, but they could rent one for $1 a year or something like that, and they would do that. All right, here's another kind of Depression era shot, but also a shot that I think is very relevant to the origin of country music. A lot of the early country musicians who recorded, Charlie Oakes, George Renaud, Mac and Bob, the people who were the recording artists of the 1920s, were blind, as is this guy. And we don't know who he is. He's unidentified. And he and his wife or companion together are playing music on looks like a steel guitar, and asking for a nickel. And he's got his tin cup lashed to his guitar, and she's holding out hers. But this is just a classic photograph I had never seen before we started doing the research for this. And I think the juxtaposition of that and the very fashionable hats in the window is kind of a striking one. But a beautiful picture, I think. Would love to know more about it. If you recognize any of those people, let us know. All right, this is a kind of well-known picture of the civil rights marches, and many of you know the guy, second or third guy from the left with the beanie. That's our good friend, Mr. Bob Booker, who was then president of his class at Knoxville College, and one of the leaders of the civil rights sit-ins of 1960. And but was you can see where this was. They're walking across Wall Avenue to the north, and you can see J.C. Penney's in the back, and Fowler, and I think Woodruff's is in there too. But they look pretty happy. It looks like they're expecting it to be a successful day, and actually the sit-ins here were pretty successful. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. The one time that Martin Luther King came to Knoxville that we know of was at the same spring as the sit-ins began in Knoxville, when he gave a commencement speech at Knoxville College when Mr. Booker graduated that day. That was a big day for him to graduate and get to see Dr. King. So it was a big deal. All right, this is a little bit later, looking down Jackson Avenue. I mentioned that company that moved when they tore their building down for the Tennessee Theater was a chemical plant, and that's actually the same company on the left that had been up on State Street that they tore the building down to build the Tennessee Theater, moved down to Jackson Avenue to these already existing buildings, which were pretty fancy buildings from the Richardsonian era, early 1890s, late 1880s. Just a great bunch of buildings there. They were built kind of at the height of this really fancy commercial architecture, period of Victorian architecture. But you can see that a lot of these buildings are not there anymore. Even this is kind of a, from our lifetime picture, and you see a Pacer there on the right, that car from the 1970s. So this is probably a late 1970s picture, but a lot of those buildings are not there anymore, and it's interesting and pretty frustrating and sad that as soon as people start talking about saving the old city, these buildings started falling down, and some of them burned, and some of them I suspect were deliberately torn down just because people were worried that they were not going to be able to after this preservation fever caught on. But there's a big gap there now in the right side of that long cluster of buildings that's now just a surface parking area. But there were some beautiful buildings in there that had been cited as being of particular interest architecturally. And of course, you see Sullivan's Saloon in the deep background, and we're glad that's still there today. It was built about the same time as the rest of these buildings were. But anyway, an interesting picture of the old city when people were just starting to notice the old city as something that might be worth saving. All right, this is from my era. I might even be in that picture somewhere if I look closely enough. But this is the World's Fair, and the most popular image of the most popular attraction of the World's Fair, which was the China Pavilion. The amazing thing that the first time the People's Republic of China had ever been in a World's Fair, and people waited for sometimes as much as 4 hours to get in and see this amazing place that broke all the rules of the fair, but because they did, they had just the most fascinating and biggest pavilion of all. Even had a restaurant in it, and live artisans and ancient statues, the old terracotta warriors and bricks of the Great Wall. And over on the right, you can see the what was claimed to be the biggest Ferris wheel in the world at the time is down on the riverfront. That's down near Volunteer Landing down there. But it was quite an amazing event, and a very familiar thing to me because I worked in crowd control, and I might have set up those white stanchions that day, but that was just an amazing memory and an amazing point in Knoxville history that we're going to be celebrating a lot, helping both Visit Knoxville and the University of Tennessee are doing 40th anniversary celebrations of the World's Fair in the next few months. So this is going to be a big deal. Get ready for that. I think they're going to have especially in May, they're going to have some big public events down there. So a lot to say about the World's Fair.
And I just want to chip in and say that following this little news item we did on Channel 10 back in, I guess, late August, early September, I mean, we've had about 1,000 images come in digitally. We've put together like a Flickr page. We'll be sharing a link of that pretty soon, actually. And this is one of the nicer ones, actually. Some of them are of the era, you might say, but James Bass got a really nice collection, so throw that in. And we're almost at the end, really, but I was lucky to be invited over to KMA and went through some of their archive photographs. And so, one of the challenges of wrapping up a book like this, when, the thrust of it and focus of it is the old photographs. So how do you bring it to, to kind of to present day in a kind of seamless way? And that's a little challenge. But with this last chapter, we want to kind of emphasize, some of the gems that we still have today, like KMA. I think the Rodin was one of their biggest exhibits, wasn't it, Jack? I think from about 1995. Some of you may have remembered that.
Yeah.
But also how it transitioned, from World's Fair Park transition from, a decade after the World's Fair and the erection of KMA. And I think 90 it opened, didn't it, Jack?
Yeah, that's right.
And that painting, black tip shark, as I recall, something like that, is still on display.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen it many times.
Yeah.
But one of the thrills for me for this book was sitting down with Dwayne Grieve, who is on our board, who's an honorary board member now, but he was involved with the preservation, restoration of the Miller's Building in the late 90s, 1998. I think it was completed with the city and KUB paid for. And we just went through all his old slides. Wayne was, in charge of it, and the caryatids, as you might call them, were very badly damaged. There is 4 that they had to restore or rebuild from scratch, I guess, in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. So we should have Dwayne on sometime to talk about that. Look up and check out the building when you're on Gay Street.
Yeah, they only found one that was intact, and they just copied that one. There had been 4 different ladies up there, but they found a one intact.
And this is it on the left. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And they just made copies of that that they put up across the front. Yeah.
Yeah. You were saying that the probably the beginning of the era of preservation and or Renaissance for downtown, perhaps, right?
Well, it was one of the things, I think the renovation of the Miller's Building was one of the things that convinced people that this was real. In the late 90s, that and the Sturkey Building and a few other things, major investments, people started thinking this is really going to happen. People are spending millions of dollars downtown. Maybe I should too. But I think that's. Yeah, it's interesting, the connection of the World's Fair to that, and because downtown still languished for some years after the fair, but about 15 years later, between Dwayne and David Dewhurst and other people that started doing, Lee Birch started doing, remarkable things downtown.
Well, that's it.
Yeah. All right.
Appreciate you joining us tonight. Open to any questions. I just want to say before we open any questions that you can order it now on our website. We'll mail it out to you over the weekend, and we'll sign it for you as well. But it will be on general sale starting next week. And we appreciate you being with us again. I also want to say we don't normally plan to release books in like January. That's not something that we were anticipating, but that's a publisher for you. They actually got it done, I think, because of COVID a little bit earlier. We were expecting it to be out to be about April. So this is not a late Christmas book, but if you got any Christmas money, maybe something you could treat yourself with.